What's going on, Guardians? It's Tizzle here, and in this video, we'll be ranking all of the seasons to ever come out in Destiny 2. But this isn't just a standard tier list video, this is a comprehensive look back at all of the seasons in Destiny 2. So with that in mind, I want to set some expectations for this video. I will not be talking about the lore or story aspects of the seasons very much, as that is not my expertise, but something that is my expertise is gameplay. I've never taken a break from Destiny 2, and I've played all the content the game has to offer, and lots of the content that the game no longer offers, but that you had to actually be there to play. I will be ranking the seasons based off my personal enjoyment of the season, but community sentiment will also be taken into account. But that means my personal biases will show, and I will talk about what I personally liked or disliked about a season. Next, I spent a ton of time researching what came out in each season, as well as reflecting on what made the season good or bad. A ton of time, effort, thought, and care went into this tier list, and as such, I hired an editor to edit this video for me. This is a video that is 7 years in the making. Destiny 2 has been through many ups and downs, and I wanted to make a video that did justice to this long journey that has led us to the heart of the Traveler to take on the Witness. So a massive shout out to my friend and editor Nuktuk for all the effort that he put into this video to make it joyful to watch and reflect back on the amazing lifespan of Destiny 2. He streams on twitch.tv/nuktuk_BDB and has a YouTube channel called Nuktuk where he puts out high quality content and does extremely difficult challenges in Destiny. He has edited a number of videos for me now, and I'm thrilled to work with him. I'm extremely grateful and appreciative of the hard work that he does, so go watch his content on Twitch and YouTube and subscribe to his channels. He definitely deserves it. And leave a like on this video while you're at it. It took a lot of work, so we would really appreciate it. Back to the criteria, I will also be including expansions and not just seasons, as this is as much a tier list as it is a retrospective on the journey of Destiny 2. So I'll be including things like dungeons that came out in a season, even if they require a dungeon key to purchase, and we'll be talking about the 30th anniversary edition, and just things like that. Like I said, I will be grading them on the metric of gameplay and content the season had to offer, more so than the story beats, as while I do enjoy the story of Destiny and watch every My Name is Bife video, I play the game for the gameplay. We will be going in chronological order and ranking the seasons from S tier to D tier. And so with that extremely long preamble out of the way, let's get into the video. The first season was Destiny 2 Vanilla, aka The Red War. This obviously had a very long campaign where the last safe city was attacked by the Red Legion Cabal forces. Dominus Gul is trying to claim the light for himself, and we have to take it back. The old tower was also destroyed, so we are forced to take refuge on the farm to gather our forces and fight back against the Cabal to save the last safe city. So D2 Vanilla actually released with some pretty high praise early on in its life cycle, but it didn't take too long for the hype to die down, especially for hardcore players. Me, I played Destiny off and on every fall for a few months during D1, so I got D2 and really enjoyed it. I completed my first raid ever in the Leviathan and kept playing it because I just loved the gameplay. Where with D1, I would always taper off after a few months, D2 actually kept my attention, mainly with the Crucible. However, for hardcore players, it left a lot to be desired. There were no more random rolls on weapons anymore, so once you had filled out your collections of weapons, there was nothing in the game to grind for. Not great for a looter shooter. There were 4 planets to explore in Nessus, Titan, Io, and Earth, and lost sectors were hyped as a big thing, but were nothing very exciting in the grand scheme of the game. You would just go to the planets and grind public events for your weekly pinnacle, and that was about it. There were also some patrols and missions you could do on each planet. Nightfall strikes didn't hit the same for many players, though we did have some innovation. There were often little mini objectives throughout the strike where you had to jump through rings or shoot anomalies to extend your timer. You could also modify the strike with a Nightfall challenge card to increase the difficulty, but also give you a higher score. This was all well and good, but there was really no incentive for going for a high score. It was just challenge for the sake of challenge. There were only 6 strikes at launch, which is not great for replayability either. And they had strike-specific loot, but again, once you got that loot, there was no reason to regrind them. The Leviathan raid had a mixed reception, but I think looking back in hindsight, players generally appreciate what it had to offer. Personally, I thought it was really cool, and it did offer a high skill gap for traversal through the underbelly. The encounters of that raid were pretty fun and unique, I thought, and they also released a prestige version of the raid which added mechanic difficulty. And that was a pretty well received addition and change, and something players still to this day yearn for. With the power of hindsight, I would say most players prefer the prestige version of raids to what we have with master raids now. Crucible launched with 9 new maps, and this is where I spent a large portion of my time in D2 vanilla, just getting shit on in the Crucible and trying to get better. I also dabbled in Trials of the 9 and got shit on even worse. Trials wasn't received all that great, but it did offer a lot of cool looking armor and some really good weapons. So this is the hardest season to rank because it really isn't even a season at all. I promise the other ones won't have as much to cover, but it was nice to take a trip down memory lane. With all that said, we'll place Red War in B tier. It was a brand new game, so players were excited, but the hype wore off quickly when once you played all the content, there was no reason to keep playing said content. So next we have Curse of Osiris. This DLC launched with another campaign that took place on Mercury. We have to rescue Osiris from the Vex and kill Panoptes the Infinite Mind. I know the campaign didn't get people very hyped, and the seasonal gameplay loop was to do just a bunch of busy work like public events to unlock weapons from the Infinite Forge and the Lighthouse, and this was basically just grind for the sake of grind. Also, you couldn't drive your Sparrow on Mercury, and it was a small planet with just one public event. However, we did get 3 brand new Crucible maps in Radiant Cliffs, Wormhaven, and Pacifica, a cadence players in today's day and age would die of shock if we received. And Burnout also returned from D1. Radiant Cliffs is still one of my favorite maps to this day, and I think all these maps are still pretty decent. For strikes, we got a Garden World and Tree of Probabilities. 2 really fun strikes which sadly no longer exist in Destiny 2, and I hope they come back soon. We got 4 exotic armor pieces per class, including Graviton Forfeit for Hunter, Helm of Saint 14 for Titan, and Ophidian Aspect for Warlock. We also got 5 exotic weapons. And lastly, we got the Eater of Worlds raid lair, which an LFG team went on to win Worlds First for. This raid was very boring for the first half, but the boss fight was pretty fun. Overall, Curse of Osiris just didn't offer much content for players, and the seasonal loop of grinding for the weapons was extremely monotonous. But it did offer a raid lair and some Crucible maps and strikes, so it wasn't all bad. Overall, I am going to put it in D tier just because it is widely looked back on as one of the worst in the history of the game. And Bungie themselves admitted that their backs were against the wall at this time. The player population was in sharp decline due to the lack of replayable content. Though from a personal standpoint, this was actually a good thing for me, as with so little to do, it forced me to make a Hunter and Titan, as up to that point I had only made a Warlock and I just mained Warlock. So that was nice as it made me branch out and make my own fun to learn the other classes. Next up we have Warmind, and full disclosure, this is the DLC that made me fall in love with Destiny 2. The story was Who Even Cares? Something with Anna Bray on Mars and something with Rasputin and killing the worm god Zol. The campaign was secondary for once compared to the content offering. It gave us our first real seasonal type activity in Escalation Protocol. This activity was genuinely hard, and you would have to manipulate loading onto Mars with other people to form fire teams of 9 to have your best chance at beating it. But it was also really fun because with hard content, it gives you satisfaction when you do finally overcome that challenge. And what was cool was it had loot worth grinding for, especially the Ikelos shotgun with trench barrel, which at the time was insanely powerful. I ran EP probably like 80 times to get all 3 weapons. They had very low drop rates, and they had different bosses week to week, 5 in total with different mechanics and stuff. Just super cool. And it also introduced Worldline 0 as an exotic, which players abused to make speedrunning super fun to watch. It also had the return of Sleeper Simulant from D1, which became my favorite weapon at the time, and I didn't take it off for months. And to this day, I still love that weapon. And there were also many secrets to be found. You had to shoot little memory fragments, which made you have to explore the location of Mars very in depth. And you also had to search for sleeper nodes. This gave players a reason to explore the planet and unlock a cool exotic when you were done. Warmind also had the raid lair Spire of Stars, which was a super mechanic heavy raid and honestly really fun. Hindsight has been very kind to this raid. It was challenging both combat wise and mechanic wise, and Bungie also introduced exotic catalysts into the game, which had you go into the prestige version of Eater of Worlds and Spire of Stars for the Telesto and Sleeper catalysts respectively. And then once you had these catalysts, you had to do a ton of grinding to complete something like the Sleeper catalyst. I remember it taking quite a while to do, and it was much more grindy than the catalysts we have today. And the Worldline 0 catalyst had you go into Escalation Protocol to hit the bosses with it. Just some super cool stuff. The raid also had a rare exotic emote, which I think Bungie should do more of. It's still a popular emote to this day, and people would grind the raid specifically just to get that. We also got 3 Crucible maps in Meltdown and Solitude, and Bannerfall returning from D1. And we got 3 new strikes as well in the Insight Terminus, Will of Thousands, and Strange Terrain. The latter 2 are also not in the game anymore, but it would be awesome if they returned as they are really fun strikes. But the star of the DLC was undoubtedly the Whisper of the Worm exotic mission. It was tough to unlock, requiring you to do hidden objectives during a public event on IO. And then you had a 20-minute timer to traverse a really complicated jumping puzzle. And then you had to battle through a ton of Taken and take down 3 Taken bosses at the end. This mission was just incredible, and the community was ignited when this secret was found in the summer of 2018. I can't tell you how hyped I was when I beat it for the first time and got the Whisper of the Worm. And on top of this, the weapon was also meta-defining at the time. It's what a looter shooter should be. Really difficult content to unlock a really good piece of loot. This mission is really what inspired me to want to get better at Destiny because I really wanted to solo it. And not only did it have a very extensive traversal section and really good combat encounters, but there were also secrets to do and discover, and if you did the secrets 3 weeks in a row, you could work towards the exotic catalyst and unlock the Thousand Wings ship. A ship that I still rock to this day on my Titan because Sunbreaker Titan was the class that I used to beat the mission for the first time. So looking back at Warmind as a whole, we got 3 Crucible maps, 3 strikes, a campaign, a new planet, secrets to find on the new planet, an innovative seasonal activity, and a hidden secret exotic mission with the best weapon in the game. Yeah, I think that's how you do a season. We also got the Polaris Lance exotic scout rifle, which is a monster in the game currently thanks to its synergy with Solar 3.0. So Warmind for me is definitely S tier. This may be a controversial ranking for some, but I think Warmind was just incredible. Again, it's what made me fall in love with Destiny 2. In the last week of that season, Bungie made it so that you could get a new Forsaken weapon with random rolls. Yes, you heard me right, random rolls were brought back to Destiny 2. And that brings us into Forsaken. The expansion itself was incredible and probably the most comprehensive change to the game overall that we've ever had. This was also the last of the seasons that were more expansions than seasons. Everything that was Outlaw was basically just tied to Forsaken, so it's hard to differentiate here. We had subclass trees back then for Arc, Solar, and Void, and every tree on every character got an additional node and many new supers were added. Random rolls were also brought back to weapons, which completely changed how we grinded the game. It gave us a reason to keep playing. Something to grind for. The Tangled Shore and Dreaming City locations were introduced, and a bit further into the expansion, the first ever dungeon came to Destiny with the Shattered Throne. We now have 8 dungeons in the game, and they do just keep getting better and better, but back then, there was a lot of complaints about a lack of endgame in Destiny 2, so this was a very welcome addition to Destiny. And I know it's quite easy now thanks to power creep, but this was extremely challenging to beat at the time. The Last Wish raid also came out, which is highly regarded as one of the greatest raids in Destiny, and the Riven fight legit is still one of the coolest boss fights we've ever had. But again, it is hard to totally distinguish between Season of the Outlaw and Forsaken. Forsaken also introduced many exotics, including 13 exotic weapons. Thunderlord came out a little while later, and Wavesplitter was a PS4 exclusive, but we'll still include them here in the total. It also brought 4 exotic armor pieces per class, including bangers like Geomag Stabilizers and Shards of Galanor, which were extremely meta for a long time. Heart of Inmost Light was also introduced at this time, and it's become meta over time thanks to a more ability-based sandbox. One-Eyed Mask was broken as hell in the Crucible for a while, and 6 Coyote and Controverse Hold are still amazing to this day and 2 of my favorite exotics for those classes. We also got 5 new Crucible maps, but sadly 3 are still sunset to this day, and Citadel only just returned recently. The other ones were Equinox, Firebase Echo, Convergence, and Gambler's Ruin. And we also got a lot of great strikes, 4 in total, one of which was Hollowed Lair, which brought Mindbender's Ambition, which was a staple in the Crucible for years, basically until Fellwinter's Lie showed up a year and a half later. But yeah, this is one of the coolest shotguns in the game, and it still holds up to this day in Crucible. We also got the Corrupted, Warden of Nothing, and Broodhold strikes. And I almost completely forgot that they introduced Gambit here too, a new PvEVP style game mode that was meant to be another core activity like strikes and Crucible. A truly innovative time for Bungie. And speaking of innovation, all the core activities got a pinnacle weapon tied to the core playlists. These weapons had unique perks that no other weapons could get, and they required some lengthy-ass quests. Regular Crucible had the Redrix's Broadsword, like the Redrix's Claymore that came before it, but with random rolls. Comp had Luna's Howl and Not Forgotten, true pinnacle weapons that terrorized the Crucible for a long time. They both came with the unique perk Magnificent Howl, which allowed a 180 RPM hand cannon to 3-tap with ease and even 2-tap in specific scenarios. So as you can see, this was an ass ton of content, and Forsaken will probably go down as the best DLC ever, let alone a season. But again, because it is so tied to a single season, I will just give it S tier. But you could easily argue it's S+ for the crazy amount of great content and game overhauls that we saw. We also got an increase to our vault space in Forsaken, which took us to 500 spots. And I didn't really talk about it too much, but Dreaming City not only had a great aesthetic, but it was also introduced as the first endgame destination. The enemies hit very hard until you were leveled up. Blind Well was a true challenge at first, especially on tier 3, and much like Mars in the Warmind DLC, there was tons of hidden secrets to find and explore. Forsaken is pretty much the gold standard as far as I'm concerned. And next is maybe one of 2 gold standards for Season, and that is Black Armory, aka Season of the Forge. We got a raid with this one in Scourge of the Past, and it had some awesome weapons back in the day, with the threat level shotgun being the only kinetic slot shoddy with Trench Barrel. And we got our first damage over time weapon in the Anarchy Raid Exotic Grenade Launcher, which was a meta-defining weapon for a number of years after its release. The raid was also fun as hell and quick to run, and you could even ride your Sparrow throughout much of the raid. Personally, I just loved this raid. This was the first true season of Bungie's new content model, so that meant more of a focus on a core gameplay activity and less focus on replayable content like Strikes and Crucible. So that meant we didn't get any new Strikes or Crucible maps, but we did get forges to grind instead. There were 4 unique forges in the Volunder, Izanami, Gofanon, and Bergusia forge, and they all had the same basic mechanics but different enemies and environments to fight in. These were controversial as you did have to level up to be able to complete them early in the season, and the last forge didn't unlock until the community solved one of the coolest secrets in Destiny, the Niobe Labs. This was an insanely cool mission. The whole Raid Secrets community came together to solve the puzzles, and it was such a cool moment when it finally got beaten. Later on, I beat it with 2 friends, and it was very tough for its time and required great teamwork and the use of the forge weapons to complete all the hidden puzzles. It was just very, very cool and unique, and I'm so glad I did it while it was available. The weapons this season were bangers as well, and it was kind of the start of getting seasonal weapons. The Hammerhead Void Machine Gun was super awesome for invading in Gambit and slaying out adds. Striker Surehand was a good sword at the time. Tatara Gaze could roll with Kill Clip, which would allow it to one-shot body shot in PvP. Blast Furnace was the first aggressive frame pulse rifle that could roll with Feeding Frenzy and either Kill Clip or Rampage, which made it a beast in the Crucible. It also had wonderful scope options, where today we really only get barrel options. And Kindled Orchid could roll with Rampage and Kill Clip, so you could get some nasty 2-taps with a 140 RPM hand cannon. Overall, there were 17 Black Armory weapons, and some only dropped from the forge itself. And then for the other ones, you would pick up a quest from A to 1 so you could target farm them. The loot this season was off the charts. We also didn't get any new exotic armor, but Forsaken had so many armor pieces to chase that it didn't really matter. This was a time when you actually had to grind for exotics. They weren't just handed out from a lost sector. So we still had lots of exotic pieces to grind for. But it did release with some absolute awesome exotic weapons. I already mentioned Anarchy from the raid, and this was the season where we also got the Last Word quest, which was really cool. And Last Word release busted on PC, but sadly I didn't play PC back then, so I never got to enjoy it to its full potential. We also got the Jotun, which was a unique fusion rifle that was very strong. Le Monarch, which terrorizes PvP to this day despite a few nerfs, and it's a rockstar in endgame PvE. It's great against overloads, and it hits like a truck on red bars and GMs. I just love this thing. And finally, we got Izanagi's Burden. It had a lengthy and cool quest attached to it, and it's still a DPS swap rotation monster to this day. And it's also really good for dealing huge burst damage on things like champions. Like I said, it's still a great weapon. The pinnacle weapons were also super good this season. Gambit had the Breakneck, which had Rampage and Onslaught, which was great for mowing down trash ads. Strikes had the Loaded Question with Reservoir Burst. This allowed a fusion rifle to have great ad clear finally, and also great damage with the autoloading Lunafaction meta at the time. And you could earn the Mountaintop from Crucible, and it was even stronger with this autoloading meta at the time. It became an absolute monster, especially when paired with Anarchy. It's kind of funny how a PvP weapon quickly became the best PvE weapon in the entire game. So with the incredible slate of weapons it introduced, a really fun raid, an awesome secret mission in Niobe Labs, and exotic weapons that still hold up to this day, Season of the Forge gets an S tier rating from me. Next, we have Season of the Drifter. This season was based around a new iteration of Gambit called Gambit Prime. I give huge props to Bungie for the innovation this season. We had a new seasonal activity called the Reckoning, which wasn't overly fun, and it was overtuned thanks to the power creep that we had at the time. Phoenix Protocol could chain Wells, and Skull of Dire Ahamkara could chain Nova Bombs, and then Orpheus Rig Hunters could chain Tethers. So if you had that set up on your team, Reckoning was a breeze. But without some of the broken stuff at the time, it could be quite difficult. So you would grind the Reckoning to get armor pieces that had set bonuses in what was called Gambit Prime. Like the Collector, which would allow you to bank 20 motes instead of 15, and this would send over an even larger Taken Ogre blocker. The set bonus type stuff was really cool, and if it was made to be a little more user friendly, then I would love to see this back in the game. Spare Rations, Gnawing Hunger, and Soul Survivor were some of the better weapons from that season, especially Spare Rations in PvP, which was a 150 RPM at the time and extremely forgiving on M&K. It ushered in the Spare Benders meta in the Crucible, which lasted for a long time. Last Man Standing, I believe, was the first weapon to get the perk 1-2 Punch, and this perk combo made some absolutely broken combinations with certain builds. The Oxygen SR3 was from Strikes, and it never really found a place, but making explosions with it was pretty fun. And 21% Delirium came from Gambit with Killing Tally and Overflow, and it was a truly great ad clear machine gun. But the ultimate pinnacle weapon was the Recluse, an insane SMG with the perk Master of Arms that made your weapon deal increased headshot and body shot damage. This damage was the same for crit and body, and it became a terror in PvP and basically a must-use weapon in PvE. It ushered in a very stale meta loadout of Anarchy, Mountaintop, and Recluse for well over a year. It was basically pointless to run anything else. And one thing I want to say here quickly is when Bungie teased the Recluse in a TWAB, the community at large bitched incessantly, saying it was underwhelming and it wasn't going to be very good. It was really annoying because the community was already complaining that this gun was trash and they hadn't even touched it. And this is a trend that I've seen a lot over the years. The community bitching about stuff before they ever even try it. They did the same with Void Hunter when Void 3.0 was teased for the Witch Queen. This is just one example, but it happens a lot. For the love of God, please stop doing this. Thanks. Anyways, back to the Recluse, it wound up being a beast and the best legendary primary in the game for a long time. Then for exotics, we got the Thorn back with a cool quest. Arbalest was introduced, which is still great in certain scenarios to this day, and Outbreak Prime returned to us in D2, this time as Outbreak Perfected. Much like Whisper of the Worm, this was a secret exotic mission with an unforgiving timer, cool combat encounters, a tough jumping puzzle section, and even a maze with a killer robot. And it had a very unique and complicated computer puzzle to unlock the exotic ship. This was a top tier secret exotic mission, and maybe even better than the Whisper mission. And lastly, for class exotic items, we got the Strongholds for Titan, Liar's Handshake for Hunter, and Getaway Artist for Warlock. All pretty solid exotics in this day and age. Overall, this is quite a tough season to rank, as if you didn't like Gambit, you weren't going to like this season. So I can definitely see it losing some points there. But with the introduction of a meta-defining pinnacle weapon like Recluse and a top-tier exotic mission that may go down as the best in the franchise, I think it sneaks into A tier. I gotta give Bungie props for taking a risk and trying out set bonuses and things like that, so it definitely deserves some praise. So following 2 pretty good seasons, Bungie had pretty high expectations, and it's safe to say that they knocked it out of the park with Season of Opulence. Once again, there were no new Strikes or Crucible maps, so the focus was on the seasonal activity. This one had the Menagerie, which is pretty much lauded as the best seasonal activity that we've ever gotten. I didn't mention it in the Forsaken part, but they had also introduced seasonal titles back then. Black Armory had Blacksmith, Season of the Drifter had Reckoner, and this one had Shadow. And back then, these were extremely prestigious and hard to get. You had to do each version of the Menagerie on Prestige mode and Flawless. This was no easy task back then. There were 3 unique bosses and they had many different encounters in the Menagerie. And one of the best parts about it was if you did all 3 requirements in an encounter before the time was up, you'd beat the activity quicker. This needs to come back into the game more. Stop time gating and damage gating and just let people slay out and in turn get to complete the activities quicker. They did a good job of this with Season of the Witch and the Altars of Summoning, so they are moving in the right direction. But what Season of Opulence did the best was to allow target farming and give the players agency. Agency is so important in games. You have to let people play how they want. And this season, they did that wonderfully. You could focus your Chalice of Opulence to get the drop that you wanted. So if you were leveling and needed a cloak, You could run a menagerie and get the armor piece that you needed, but couldn't get thanks to RNG. This was amazing, and for farming weapons, it was perfect because you could focus farm so that you could get your god roll, Beloved, or Awstringer. You couldn't pick the rolls, which I think is fine as it allows for replayability and grinding, but you could pick the masterwork that you wanted with the Chalice. All that being said, there was a glitch that let you focus up to 3 or 4 weapons per run, but it wasn't intended. Bungie eventually patched this, but most players had their god rolls by then. However, if you only got 1 drop per run for a 15 to 20 minute activity, I think this would have been too stingy, and people definitely wouldn't look back on the menagerie quite so fondly. Not saying it was bad by any means, but an activity raining targeted loot on you certainly helped the enjoyment. Opulence also introduced the Wendigo GL3 for strikes, which was an absolute monster. It had explosive light, which made it hit very hard, but it also had blinding grenades, and to this day, this is the only heavy slot GL to ever have blinding grenades, and they're now called disorienting grenades, and these had wonderful utility. I utilized them to stun the knights in the Prophecy dungeon and get my first solo flawless. It's a very good weapon. We also had the Hush bow from Gambit, which was a unique bow that allowed us to shoot very quickly, and for the 4th straight season, we got a meta-defining Crucible Pinnacle weapon in the Revoker. Back then I played on console, so I sniped a lot more being on a controller, and this was basically all I used in trials. It was a monster because missing would give you ammo back, and you could even refund ammo if you shot a Titan Barricade. This thing was just nasty in PvP at the time. I would pair it with my Drang Barak for pretty much every Trials game. And speaking of Drang, it was one of many great weapons from Season of Opulence. Beloved was a fan favorite PvP sniper with quick draw and snapshot, though I went with snapshot moving target back in the day. It suited my playstyle more. And Awstringer was my favorite hand cannon ever. My role was Subsistence Rampage and it wrecked. And that was when Subsistence actually had a trade-off because back then you still needed to pick up primary ammo. And we also got some class-specific swords as well. All this, and I didn't even mention that we got a raid with the Crown of Sorrow, so that makes 3 raids in 4 seasons after Forsaken. This was a pretty darn good raid, but none of the loot stands out that much. Though I did love Emperor's Courtesy, the Arc Shotgun. We got Khepri's Sting, Peregrine Greaves, and Astrocyte Verse for exotic armor, and for weapons, Truth was a menace in Gambit and PvP, Lumina had a cool quest and is very unique and strong, and we got another exotic mission for a returning D1 OG in Bad Juju, though this exotic mission wasn't as good as Whisper or Outbreak. And then from the raid, you could also get Teraba. And we also got the Tribute Hall for a testing ground, and man do I miss it. It's an absolute travesty that we don't have a testing ground in this day and age, and it's actually when I got into testing stuff and started thinking of making a YouTube channel. I miss it so much, and I hope that we get a new testing ground very soon, hopefully with the final shape. So with a raid, some strong weapons, and one of the best seasonal activities ever, not to mention the target farming, Season of Opulence definitely gets an S tier rating. It's an outstanding season, and it set the expectations very high for Shadowkeep. So now we move into Shadowkeep, but more specifically, Season of the Undying. This was basically the birth of the seasonal cadence that we have now, as this is when we got our first taste of a battle pass with weapons and armor ornaments in it. And the seasonal activities now wouldn't go away until the next expansion, where with the previous year, they went away when the season was over, causing big FOMO. So now I can focus less on expansion and more on seasonal specific content. That being said, I do want to mention some things that Shadowkeep introduced. It brought in champions, which fundamentally changed the way that we played Destiny, and we were also introduced to finishers. And it introduced the seasonal artifact, and it also introduced Armor 2.0, which changed build crafting as we know it, and really made your armor matter for the first time in Destiny 2. It was definitely a more convoluted system than we have now, but it was really nice to finally be able to build craft in a meaningful way. If Warmind is what made me fall in love with Destiny 2, then Shadowkeep is what made me love PvE. I was in a PvP focused clan at the time, but with the introduction of the seasonal artifact, Armor 2.0, and champions, I started to gravitate more towards PvE and doing challenging PvE content like my first flawless raid with Garden of Salvation. Some of the exotic weapons and armor that were tied to Shadowkeep specifically include really good items like Assassin's Cowl and Xenophage. Garden of Salvation wasn't the most well received raid, but it's still okay, but it brought with it one of the best raid exotics that we've seen with Divinity. This weapon was basically a must run on every raid team, and it still has some uses to this day despite being nerfed. Shadowkeep also introduced 3 new Crucible maps in Fragment, Twilight Gap, and Widow's Court, and the Festering Core and Scarlet Keep were introduced as strikes. Another thing that happened when Shadowkeep arrived was Pinnacles were basically deemed too powerful, and for good reason. Because they had unique weapon traits, they were often extremely strong, and as I mentioned, things like the Mountaintop and Recluse just sucked the life out of all the other weapons. So with Undying, they made the switch to ritual weapons. Ritual weapons were much easier to obtain than Pinnacle weapons, and dropped with 2 perks in each column with perks that were generally pretty good. So it was a good way for more casual players to obtain something like a B+ type weapon. The ritual weapon for this season from Strikes was Edgewise, which had Feeding Frenzy or Field Prep in the left column, and Rampage and Demolitionist in the right. And I believe the perk Demo was new with this season, and it's still one of the best weapon perks to this day. Randy's Throwing Knife was a Crucible ritual, and this thing was actually pretty great. I remember really liking it in PvP. An exit strategy came from Gambit, and I actually really liked this weapon. I used it in the Pit of Heresy on my Assassin's Cowl Hunter build for my first ever solo Flawless. It had Swashbuckler, which paired great with the Add Clear Assassin build. So that was a brief recap of basically everything that Shadowkeep introduced, but now I want to focus on Season of the Undying, which had us fighting the Vex in the Vex Offensive. This was a pretty boring seasonal activity, and the weapons, which were recently reprised in Season of the Wish, never really made a splash. The weapon pool was kind of small, but there were a ton more weapons tied to the Moon and the Garden of Salvation raid. But yeah, the Vex offensive weapons kind of sucked. Pluperfect and Temporal Claws were weapons from the Season Pass, and Pluperfect was actually low-key cracked for an auto rifle in PvP, as it could get some stupid range. Ariana's Vow was a seasonal exotic, which was our first one ever from the Season Pass. This was a monster back then because it was the first weapon with champion stunning capability. It had anti-barrier built in, and the catalyst gave it 3 more rounds and autoloading holster. It quickly became a staple in most people's loadouts and Master Nightfalls back in the day. Monte Carlo was also introduced, and there was a quest for unlocking Leviathan's Breath, which was pretty cool. But Levi's was nowhere near the powerhouse back then that it is today. It was actually pretty underwhelming at launch. There were also no new exotic armor pieces outside of the ones tied to Shadowkeep. A lot of people were hopeful that the final Vex offensive might bring back a beloved weapon from D1, the Imago Loop, but sadly this was not the case. Overall, this was a very underwhelming season, especially coming off the heels of such bangers like Opulence and Black Armory. But as is often the case to this day, the seasons that launch with big expansions tend to not be as meaty or as good, in part because it's launching with so much other content. But on its own, Undying is one of the worst seasons we've ever gotten, and places firmly in the D tier. Season of Dawn was next and saw the return of Saint 14, an absolutely iconic Titan. This season's armor set from the Season Pass was super cool and still one of my favorites. You also got the Trophy Hunter Sniper Rifle and the Pyroclastic Flow Rocket Launcher. Ritual weapons included Python from Gambit, Buzzard from Strikes, and the Komodo 4 FR from the Crucible. All of them were pretty underwhelming. The seasonal activity was a sundial, and I think there were 3 variants with different bosses for each one. With champions being so new, these activities were actually kind of tough at the time if you didn't have a good team. You could also focus farm the weapons that you wanted, which was extremely nice, as I already talked about how nice Agency is. And some of these weapons were freaking awesome. Martyr's Retribution was a fan favorite, and I absolutely loved Steel Feather Repeater. Breachlight was a hard-hitting sidearm, and Perfect Paradox is still one of the best-looking shotguns they've ever made. There were obelisks on different planets, and upgrading them gave you new armor mods. These worked as a Charge with Light system and further improved our build crafting in Destiny 2 in a very fun and meaningful way. For Crucible enjoyers, we got Rusted Lands back from D1 and PvP. Symmetry was a seasonal exotic, and it is quite niche and not that great. Devil's Ruin was introduced with a quest, and again, this is a pretty niche weapon. It did have the ability to intrinsically stun Unstoppables, however, so it became the second weapon with such capability after Ariana's Vow, so it did have some additional utility. But at the time, using a sidearm in endgame content was not the best idea. And finally, we got Bastion from the Corridors of Time. Much like how the community had a unique activity to complete with Niobe Labs, Corridors of Time was a community puzzle with everyone working together. And Bastion was the reward, a kinetic fusion rifle. I don't believe it could stun Unstoppables when it was introduced, but it would get that functionality later. It was pretty decent in PvE, but it was an absolute beast in Crucible for a long time. As for exotic armor, we got Prometheum Spurs, which have basically been ass since launch, Bombardiers, which are pretty niche, and Severance Enclosure, which was shipped for like 4 years and recently got a buff, so now it's at least usable and lower end content. We also got that Stonks meme for turning in Polarized Fractaline, which was a seasonal currency. The seasonal weapons were pretty iconic for the time, and the introduction of Charge of Light mechanics fundamentally changed how we played Destiny. We got a pretty good and fun seasonal activity with lots of player agency for loot farming. So that's pretty much all you can ask for in a season in my opinion. I give Season of the Dawn an A tier rating. Next was Season of the Worthy. This had a public event style activity, and Bungie made a ridiculous community requirement to complete a shit ton of them late in the season, which wasn't well received at all. The activity was pretty boring, and being late in the season, no one wanted to keep grinding it. The season also came out as COVID began to shut down the entire world. Aside from the boring public event activity, it also saw you clearing out bunkers on various destinations. These were pretty quick missions, but one huge introduction that came in this season was Warmind cell mods. These further enhance our build crafting and were extremely meta for a very long time. It also saw the return of Trials of Osiris, a beloved game mode from Destiny 1 that gave PvP players an endgame activity. Astral Horizon was one of the best PvP shotguns that you could get, and you could only get it in Trials. The 7 Seraph weapons were the seasonal weapons, and they, along with the Ikelos weapons, were the only weapons in the game that could make Warmind cells. So even though the rolls were pretty crap for a lot of these weapons, they were very strong thanks to their Warmind synergy. Felwinter's Lie also made its triumphant comeback from D1, and it was a super strong energy slot shotgun that was meta for a long time. It was the only shotgun in the game with the perk shot package, and it could roll with quick draw and opening shot, so it was just ridiculously consistent and could map players. So not only did Trials come back for endgame PvP, but Bungie introduced Grandmaster Nightfalls for endgame PvE players. These were a daunting challenge at the time, and only the best of the best players would be able to beat Grandmaster Nightfalls. Tommy's Matchbook was a seasonal exotic weapon, which wasn't all that great, and we also got the 4th Horseman Special Shotgun, which is a burst DPS king to this day. And we also got Heir Apparent for the first ever Guardian games. For exotic armor, we got Citan's Ramparts, which were pretty great in PvP for a time, Raiju's Harness, which is pretty much useless, and Felwinter's Helm, which is pretty good in niche scenarios for solo speedrunning. And we also got 3 new Crucible maps in Cauldron, Exodus Blue, and Anomaly, which is the last Crucible edition we would see for a very, very long time. Like, very long. I'm talking 7 seasons long. Well over a year. There were also no ritual weapons in Season of the Worthy, which was somewhat disappointing. The season ended with a live event of the Almighty being shot down by Rasputin Warminds. This was a pretty cool and unique thing, and I don't think anything like that has happened since in the game. All in all, a lot was added to the foundation of the game in Season of the Worthy. We got Trials of Osiris, which was massive for PvP streamers, and Grandmaster Nightfalls, which really gave PvE players an endgame challenge to overcome, a reason for grinding. So those changes absolutely deserve praise, and it is the only thing rescuing Worthy from D tier, because the seasonal activities themselves were pretty lame. So because of the things it did for the broader game as a whole, I am putting Worthy in C tier. Next up was Season of Arrivals, and this season was the longest in the franchise at that point. Arrivals was 5 months long, but the game was in a pretty good spot thanks to the changes that were brought about with Season of the Worthy. This season brought us our 3rd dungeon, Prophecy. The aesthetic of this dungeon is my favorite, and overall, this is one of my favorite dungeons in the entire game. It was very tough to solo flawless back in the day, and in my opinion, it has the nicest solo flawless emblem. The dungeon was also free to all players, I believe. The seasonal activities were just doing glorified public events. It wasn't anything too amazing. We were introduced to Umbral Engrams, which would be a way to focus farm loot that we wanted and would be a big part of the game going forward. The seasonal weapon was Witherhoard, which is probably the greatest seasonal weapon we've ever gotten. We also got Traveler's Chosen and Ruinous Effigy. All of these exotics were very unique, so I give mad props to the exotic weapon team for these. We didn't get any exotic armor pieces or new strikes or crucible maps, but we did get a new Grandmaster rotation. The seasonal weapons were pretty good, with a meta-defining sword and the Falling Guillotine. This thing launched strong as hell and was a vortex frame, which is basically a legend version of Dark Drinker from D1. Pairing this with Witherhoard was an extremely powerful combination. First in, last out was also a very strong slug shotgun. And the beloved Ikelos weapons from Warmind were also reprised and worth grinding for. Because this season was so long, this is when I personally got into solo content. I solo flawless my first Nightfall as well as Prophecy and Shattered Throne. I had already done the Pit of Heresy the season prior. I also soloed the Whisper of the Worm mission and Outbreak Perfected mission. I did the Bad Juju one too, but I'm not sure when. Basically, I was just trying to get better at soloing content. So maybe Arrivals wasn't that great of a season, but with the quality of life and base game changes that they made in Season of the Worthy, I really enjoyed just grinding what the game had to offer at the time. Coming up with fun builds and using a variety of weapons, as 11 seasons into the game, we now had lots of choices at our disposal. So for me, Arrivals was a B tier season. Not a lot of seasonal stuff per se, but the game as a whole was in a pretty good spot. And also, because COVID was in full swing, there was a delay to Beyond Light, so I took the opportunity to finally make the switch to PC. I bought my PC in August 2020 and practiced getting better with M&K. I soloed some dungeons on PC to help myself get better, and I made my first YouTube video in October 2020, which is me soloing the Outbreak Perfected mission flawlessly. So personally, I was very happy for the extended season, just like I'm happy for this extended season to be able to make such a long video looking back at all the seasons of Destiny 2 that we've had over the last 7 years. So if you're still watching, thank you, and why not hit that subscribe button. On to Beyond Light and Season of the Hunt. Once again, this is an awkward season because it launches alongside an expansion. So we got the Deepstone Crypt raid, which had some awesome weapons, and we got the Lament and Stasis from Beyond Light, which were very strong at launch. And in my opinion, Stasis was pretty instrumental as it laid the groundwork for future 3.0 subclasses. But Season of the Hunt itself just saw us working with Crow, who is Uldren Sov reincarnated. We had to take out Wrathborn enemies, and you could melt these guys in no time flat, which was nice for doing the activity quickly and getting your loot. But the loot left a lot to be desired. Deafening Whisper is pretty much the only weapon worth mentioning, a rare Waveframe GL, and it could roll with autoloading holster. Friction Fire was the only other decent weapon. The Season Pass exotic was a Duality Shotgun, which some people like for PvP, and it is good in extremely niche situations in PvE. And the Hawkmoon was reintroduced into the game, but this time it wasn't random, and if you were a skilled shot, you could proc the one-shot bullet quite frequently. The sound design on this weapon is just incredible. That caw when you get paracausal shot is just awesome. The Hawkmoon mission also had 3 variations to it, which was pretty cool, and you could farm it for random rolls. It wasn't on the level of Whisper or Outbreak, but it was probably better than the Bad Juju mission. With this season came the introduction of sunsetting, so we lost a ton of our old gear. We basically could only use things after Season of the Undying. Everything from before then was sunset aside from exotics, but Beyond Light didn't really introduce enough new good weapons to take their place, so the game was in an awkward spot for about a year. We also lost planets like Titan and Io, and a ton of good Crucible maps, fun Nightfall strikes, and engaging raids. So Bungie had done a great job building the game up so we had lots to play and enjoy, and then ripped like half of it away. Like I said, just prior to this with Arrivals, the seasonal activity was very mid, but I was still enjoying the game. Where now we had to regrind armor, get new weapons, and had far less content to play overall. So Season of the Hunt is a D tier season for me. Not an engaging seasonal activity, and really nothing outside of the raid weapons that were worth grinding for. We did get 2 strikes at least, the Glassway, which was super challenging on release, and the Disgraced, which was brought back from D1. And we also got Title Gilding, so this was a nice addition as it did give you a reason to regrind Grandmasters, or at least beat them once for the Gilded Seal. One huge change Beyond Light brought was solo Lost Sectors, which you could farm for exotics. This was right around the time I was getting into solo play, so I found myself doing these a lot and trying to get better and faster times. To this day, this is now how we farm our exotic armor pieces instead of having to rely on RNG. And lastly, we also got ritual weapons back, but they got a rework, and instead of getting 1 for strikes, 1 for crucible, and 1 for gambit, we would just get 1 a season and you could grind it out however you wanted. Personally, I think this was a good compromise from the system that we had before. The ritual weapon this season was adored. It rolled a triple tap Vorpal for PvE and Killing When Snapshot for PvP. So this gave players a very well-rounded weapon that was very good in both aspects of the game. Like I said, I really like where they landed with rituals in the end. Not so strong that they are a must-use like Pinnacles, but also not super watered down like they became when we had things like the Komodo 4 FR. Because before they had to make 3 a season, 1 for each ritual activity, but now they could just focus on 1 a season and give players multiple ways to grind for it. Oh wow, 13 pages into the script and I'm only at the halfway point of the seasons. On to the next one, we have Season of the Chosen. We are introduced to Callus's daughter Keitel, and this starts the beginning of us forming alliances with other factions to hopefully take on the Witness. This was the season when we would be introduced to the Helm, and this season was a big step up from the previous one. I mentioned how we lost lots with the launch of Beyond Light, but Chosen gave us a new strike in the Proving Grounds, which was a very difficult Nightfall at the time, and 2 more reprised D1 strikes in Fallen Saber and Devil's Lair, 2 of the funner strikes in Destiny. This season also introduced adept weapons, so now we actually had a reason to run GMs more than once a season for gilding the title. We got the adept palindrome this season as well, which was an excellent hand cannon. Extraordinary Rendition, Imperial Needle, and Threaded Needle were excellent weapons, and Frenzy was introduced into the perk pool, which is still one of the best weapon perks to this day. Far Future, Brass Attacks, and Code Duello could also get some pretty nice rolls. So these weapons were the best seasonal weapons we had seen in a while. Meanwhile, we got the Messenger and Igneous Hammer in Trials, which were PvP all-stars and are still very good to this day. And Soulless Scar is also a unique sword that came from Trials. I mentioned the Strike loot pool got Palindrome, but we also got Shadow Price and the Swarm, which are pretty decent weapons. So after Sunsetting decimated our loadouts, Bungie finally did a good job of giving us viable alternatives. Ironically, they would walk back the Sunsetting decision, so this was the last season of Sunsetting. This means that Season of the Dawn armor and weapons were the last to get hit by Sunsetting. As for the seasonal activity itself, this was the introduction of Battlegrounds to the game. These are like strikes, but with more enemy density and a bit different design. Overall, they were pretty fun to run. We got Tiku's Divination as a seasonal weapon, which is still a very good solar bow, and the other exotic weapon was the Dead Man's Tail, a super unique hip-firing Tex Mechanica scout rifle. This thing was a monster in the Crucible and held up well in GMs with Anti-Barrier Scout Rifle. It came to us in the Presage exotic mission, which was probably the best exotic mission that we've had since Outbreak. And this just meant more fun content to try and solo for yours truly, and I really liked the challenge. It's almost like when Bungie puts a timer on a mission, it makes it that much more fun, because there are actual stakes to the combat and a reward for mastery. We got Curse of the Falling Star to buff our Thunder Crash, Omni Oculus to give you permanent invisibility, and Mantle of Battle Harmony, which has always been a slept-on exotic. And lastly, we had the introduction of the third combat style mod type being Elemental Wells, so this gave us even more depth to our build crafting arsenal. I didn't realize until I wrote this script and researched everything, but looking back on it, this season had a lot to offer. It had great loot for its time and brought some awesome changes to the game. This is also the time when Bungie really settled into the formulaic seasonal model. 1 exotic weapon from the season pass, 1 from a quest or a mission, 1 exotic for each class, this season being all chess pieces, a dungeon one season, and a reprised raid the next. The formulaic upgrade table, you get the idea. This one just didn't have a dungeon. If it had, then it may have snuck into A tier, but I will give it a very strong B. This was a solid season and brought us some great loot to chase, something that we've been sorely lacking after Sunsetting. The next season was Season of the Splicer, and speaking of formulaic development, Bungie loves to put out its worst content in the summer season in my opinion, which I'm fine with as I prefer to not game as much in the summer anyways. Not saying this season was horrible, but it definitely wasn't amazing. We got our first reprised raid from D1 being introduced to D2 with the Vault of Glass, and it turned out really good. Bungie has honestly done a truly amazing job in reprising the raids from D1 into D2, and this definitely gave us an incentive to play. I still love my Fatebringer, and a lot of the other loot was pretty good too. We had a weekly expunge mission, and then a 6-player override mission. The 6-player missions could have easily been 3-player missions though, as people were constantly fighting over enemies to kill. And the expunge missions were pretty cool with that sci-fi Vex theming that they had. Vex Mythoclast was the raid exotic and a very fun gun, and the seasonal weapon was Cryesthesia 77k, which is a pretty niche but strong weapon. The seasonal weapons were also pretty cool and I loved their aesthetic. Ignition Code with Slide Shot was the best of the bunch, and I still have a Chroma Rush that I like to use. I mean, it's no Steel Feather repeater, but it does the trick. And Sojourner's Tale is also a good Solar Slug shotgun. And they also introduced a massive version of AUG, so we could grind for time lost weapons. Basically the adept version, but with a raid themed name. And we got the Uzume and Plug 1 introduced as Nightfall weapons, and Shiora's Wrath for trials. Null Composure was a ritual weapon, and once again, a very good weapon. And we also got a few more Elemental Well mods. Each class got new exotic boots, with the Hunter Star Eater scales being the cream of the crop. Path of the Burning Steps had some decent play with the right build, and Boots of the Assembler are the ultimate healer exotic. Story-wise, we end up killing Quaria the Blade Transform in a pretty cool mission, but for such a highly regarded character in the lore, it was a pretty underwhelming mission, though I did like soloing it, as like I said, I was getting more and more into soloing everything I could by this point. Overall, this was a pretty mid-season, I think. The glorified public event was pretty boring, and the loot was nothing to write home about, so I give Splicer a C tier rating. So if you thought Season of Arrivals was long and dragged on, well, COVID dragged on for a long time, which meant that there was a delay to the Witch Queen expansion, and this meant that Season of the Lost went from late August to late February, almost 6 full months. Luckily, we had a super awesome artifact to tide us over thanks to particle deconstruction, which made fusion rifles and linear fusions hit like a truck. And we also got another special linear fusion rifle from the season pass in the Lorentz driver, and this thing was broken as hell in the Crucible at launch, giving you the ability to one-shot to the body and have wall hacks. This thing was crazy. It could also suck enemies in, so it helped negate the worst part of linear fusion rifles, which is ad clear. And the seasonal quest exotic was Egger's Scepter, which is an absolutely cracked weapon. I love this thing. The seasonal weapons weren't as good, however. Fractithus was a PvP all-star, and Chrysera Mellow is one of my favorite weapons, but it's pretty niche. I only like it because I have a really good roll with Frenzy. We got Reed's Regret and Trials, which was the first stasis linear fusion rifle, and Nightfalls introduced the Hothead, which was a meta rocket launcher for a very long time. And speaking of good rocket launchers, the Ascendancy was a seasonal ritual weapon, and it had some pretty decent perks, especially Explosive Light. This season had the Astral Alignment 6-player activity, which was actually very fun. Maybe it's because I love the Dreaming City, but yeah, I really like this one. We also got the Shattered Realms with a few different variants and a ton of secrets. I love the aesthetic of these missions, as well as the challenging gameplay. I really enjoyed coming up with unique builds to solo these, as build crafting was pretty much at its peak at this point. And this was back when soloing things was difficult. That's because in the Witch Queen, we would soon get introduced to 3.0 subclasses, which definitely power crept us and made endgame content more easy. And because this was such a long season, I decided to try soloing my first GM, which was Devil's Lair. I'm really glad I soloed at least one before the 3.0 subclass changes. Also, because this was such a long season, I made a huge in-depth breakdown of all the armor mods in Destiny, so again, I was very glad for an extended season. They also brought back Trials of the 9 weapons into a refreshed loot pool for the Prophecy dungeon, and we got the last of the new Elemental Well mods, which really rounded out a ton of ways for us to build craft however we wanted. For exotic armor, we got Nothing Manacles, no backup plans, and Radiant Dance Machines. Not terrible, but not amazing exotics. Overall, I give Season of the Lost a B. The weapons were pretty crap, but the exotic weapons were great, and the gameplay was very fun, and so were both seasonal activities between Astral Alignment and Shattered Realms. I quite enjoyed the gameplay that season. And in the latter half of this season, we were introduced to the 30th Anniversary Pack. Even though it wasn't a full-fledged season, it really gave us something to do for these 6 months. It introduced awesome weapons with things like Eager Edge on the half-truce and other half-swords, and it brought us the first legendary trace rifle in the Retraced Path. We also got the BXR Battler and the Forerunner exotic sidearm from Halo, and we would earn these weapons from the Dares of Eternity, a pretty cool new mission with rotating encounters and bosses. We also got the Grasp of Avarice dungeon, which was a smashing hit. This dungeon was a tough solo at the time, again because we didn't have the 3.0 subclasses or the resilience changes that we have today, and the boss health pools were pretty large at the time. And this dungeon also brought back the legendary Galahorn, the amazing exotic rocket launcher from D1. This thing was a monster in D1 and it got reworked, but it's still a monster in D2. And it also brought back some other fan favorites like the 1000 Yard Stare, Matador 64, and Ias Luna. The master version of this dungeon also introduced Artifice armor to us for the first time. This gave you an extra artifact mod slot at the time, but this would just give you a stat bump later on down the line when they reworked armor. This was the breath of fresh air that Destiny needed during a long season. I'd definitely give 30th Anniversary an A tier rating. Witch Queen launched in February 2022, and the campaign was amazing. The Vow of the Disciple raid was also incredible and had some very meta weapons, but we won't really be touching on those here, as I want to instead just focus on Season 16, Season of the Risen. One thing that Witch Queen brought was a couple new strikes in the Lightblade and Birthplace of the Vile, so this at least spruced up the strike playlist. But once again, no new Crucible maps. Season 16 brought us Psyops Battlegrounds and had us fighting the Lucent Hive, which was a new enemy type to Destiny 2. It also gave us Void 3.0, which fundamentally changed how we build crafted. This was the first subclass to get the Stasis Aspects and Fragments treatment, and let me tell you, we had some amazing builds. Yes, we lost some great things like Heart of the Pack on Void Hunter, but overall, I think this was great. Personally, I would have loved if Witch Queen was Destiny 3. We could have kept the subclass trees as Destiny 2 and introduced the all-new subclass 3.0s at once in Destiny 3, but that is neither here nor there. So what did Chosen offer us? We had the Grand Overture exotic machine gun from the Season Pass, which is a pretty good exotic, though it honestly feels like shit to shoot. We finally got rid of Umbral Engrams and we could target weapons and armor in the helm, and these armor pieces dropped us some cracked rolls that you could manipulate with your ghost mods. The weapons from the season itself were pretty decent, but now, for the first time, we could craft weapons in the Enclave, so all the seasonal weapons were craftable. So even though we could target farm loot, we are now just trying to farm red borders. Crafting at launch was very unwieldy with a ton of useless resources and gates for the sake of gates, but it was nice to have the option to craft if we wanted. All of these weapons had some very viable rolls, so they were quite strong. This was also around the time that Bungie started introducing new weapon perks as well, like unique ones, so the go-to god roll was no longer just fast reload perk and damage increasing perk. This was also a great change to the game as a whole. Reckless Endangerment was a ritual weapon, and it was what most ritual weapons now were. A solid option, but far from best in slot. We got another exotic mission for a super cool weapon in the Dead Messenger. I've always really liked this weapon, and it was a beast in the Crucible for a while. The mission itself was pretty unique, but again, way more on par with something like the Hawkmoon mission than something like Whisper, Outbreak, or even Presage. The exotic armor pieces were more tied to Witch Queen, but even still, the Osmiomancy gloves for Warlock are the only ones that really stand out, though Lordly Splendor Helm and Renewal Grasps did terrorize PvP for a while. So as I've talked about a lot to this point, most seasons tied to DLC, this one included, didn't offer a whole lot of substance. You got some battlegrounds and some decent weapons that we could now craft, but nothing about this season was very special. This one gets a C tier. Next was Season of the Haunted, and with it brought Solar 3.0. Solar 3.0 launched extremely strong, and it has been great ever since. Honestly, probably the strongest subclass in the game. It brought back the Derelict Leviathan, and a bunch of characters had to work through their past traumas. We got the Trespasser back from D1, and this sidearm is an absolute ad clear machine, but sadly, with the sandbox being the way it is, ad clear is typically just better served to an ability spam build now. That being said, it is still a decent weapon. This season brought back some fan favorites with the Drang Barak, Beloved, Callous Mini Tool, and Awstringer. Bungie was definitely playing fan service this season. The Nezarac's Whisper is probably the best glaive in the game, and the other weapons were no slouches, with Firefright and Without Remorse being pretty good weapons in their own right. Once again, it was all about the chase for red borders. We would clear out nightmares and nightmare containment on the Derelict Leviathan, and run Sever missions to deal with different characters' past traumas. But I think 17 seasons in, players started realizing that there are only so many ways we can kill bad guys. So the franchise fatigue was starting to set in, I think, but Solar 3.0 really helped to freshen things up. Also, this was the season of the resilience changes, so now the higher resil you had, the more damage resistance you got. This made soloing GMs and dungeons so much easier. As a result, Vow the Disciple was probably the last day 1 raid where survivability was a true challenge. Also, the power creep of the 3.0 subclasses was also starting to settle in, as people were finding amazing ways to break the game. This also coincided with the launch of the Duality Dungeon and the real introduction of the dungeon keys. Prophecy was free and Grasps was sold with the 30th Anniversary Edition, but this is when they were truly separate from seasonal purchases. But as I said at the top of the video, I will be including dungeons in the seasons that they came out in, and Duality was a really good and challenging dungeon. And thank God we had those resil changes and the extreme power that is Restoration with Solar 3.0, because this was a tough dungeon. In that season, we also had Classy Restoration on the seasonal artifact. So for me personally, this is when I really started to solo GMs with some regularity. I didn't like soloing them before because getting one shot from full health is just not fun. It feels like there's nothing you can do about it. But now I could just run 100 resilience and have a chance to survive things that would one-shot me before. So this is when I really started to enjoy soloing GMs. As for the dungeon, it had the exotic Heart Shadow, which is a super cool exotic sword. I wish they would revert it to how it used to work. They nerfed it shortly after launch, and I haven't used it much since. The rest of the dungeon weapons are probably the coolest looking weapons in the game, and they are pretty good as well. The Fixed Odds machine gun returned from Opulence, as did the Epicurean. And Fixed Odds is still currently a monster, mainly due to the perk Incandescent, which is another one of those new perks that Bungie introduced that is very strong and that synergize with the 3.0 subclasses. We also finally got a Crucible map for the first time in over 2 years, and it was Disjunction, maybe the most widely hated map in the game. It was also brought in to support the return of Rift, which made its debut in Destiny 2 and Iron Banner. And it too hasn't had the warmest reception in Destiny 2, but I was at least glad Bungie was trying to innovate. For exotic armor pieces, we got Caliban's Hand, Second Chance, and Rain of Fire. All pretty decent exotics and very strong in the right builds or content. So overall, this season had some great weapons, serviceable seasonal activities, and the introduction of a super powerful subclass, and a great and challenging dungeon. But it did pay a lot of fan service with bringing back the menagerie weapons, and even though the seasonal missions were pretty fun, it was just starting to feel kinda samey for me. The introduction of Solar 3.0 really helped carry this season, giving us new ways to play and build craft. And the resilience changes allowed me to more easily solo GMs, which wound up giving me new challenges to pursue. So I will give this season a solid B. It had a good content offering, but for me, the content was a little stale. The narrative and seasonal stuff was just so-so, but new dungeons and subclass 3.0s were always exciting. On to the next season, I didn't enjoy this one nearly as much. Once again, the summer seasons just always seem kind of meh. But because of Witch Queen's delay, this season was more like the fall season. So I guess I should say the third season after an expansion is just mediocre. Season of the Plunder brought in Arc 3.0, which was and is a ton of fun, but the seasonal activity was not that great. There were 3-man expeditions and weekly pirate hideouts, and they were fine, I guess. And Catch Crash was a 6-player activity that was actually pretty decent, but man, the expeditions actually sucked. But yeah, Destiny had introduced seasonal challenges with the Witch Queen, but they used them to really pad out player engagement this season. Late in the season, when everyone was done grinding, they would throw in a challenge that wasn't retroactive that made players grind an activity that they've already done a shit ton of. This was not fun at all. They had also throttled red border drop rates early in the season, and you had to wait to unlock more nodes on your seasonal upgrade grid to get them easier. This time gating shit was really freaking annoying, and I think it hit a peak in Season of the Plunder. You were incentivized to actually just wait 10 weeks before engaging with the season, because Bungie changed a bunch of Triumph requirements that were way overtuned. This season fucking pissed me off because it felt like my time wasn't valued at all. They were just farming engagement in predatory and manipulative ways. The loot from the season was also extremely mid. Kingsfall Raid came back to Destiny, and this was the only redeeming part to this season. I absolutely love this raid, and the loot from it is really good. And the mechanics of the raid were just awesome. Just such a wonderful raid. High praise to the raid team. Touch of Malice was the raid exotic, and it's pretty cool and unique, even if it's not the most meta. And you could get Quicksilver Storm if you pre-ordered Lightfall. And then Delicate Tomb was a seasonal exotic. A cool weapon in low-end content, but it sucks in higher-end content. We also got some pretty strong exotic armor this season. Fallen Sunstar is great, as is Gerfalcon's Hauberk. It was kind of busted at launch, but the rework to it now made it mostly just busted in PvE. And Point Contact Cannon Brace is one buff away from being awesome. Cry Mutiny was the ritual weapon, and it's a super cool cannonball style aesthetic. So while we did get some decent exotic pieces and a really good reprised raid as usual, Plunder gets a D from me. The season itself sucked in my opinion, and King's Fall was the only fun part of it. Season of the Seraph was a pretty cool season centered around Anna and Rasputin. We got Heist Battlegrounds as a seasonal activity. Again, just more battlegrounds, nothing too amazing. The ritual weapon was the Velis X Aggressive Pulse Rifle, and again, nothing amazing. We got no exotic armor pieces either. The seasonal exotic was Manticore, a unique SMG based around floating in the air. It did recently get a buff, but I still don't really like the playstyle that it promotes. We got another dungeon, Spire the Watcher, and as far as dungeons go, I would also say good but nothing amazing. It had basic mechanics and a reused Harpy boss from Garden of Salvation and very mid weapons. But the final boss was pretty cool. You can speed the final fight up a lot if you know what you're doing, and it is cool to have to avoid the boss while you're doing the mechanics. Some of the weapons were prized Seraph weapons, which rubbed some people the wrong way. But yeah, the loot was pretty mid in this dungeon. Even the exotic was Hierarchy of Needs, which is a cool weapon, but far from meta-defining. For seasonal loot, we got the Ikelos weapons brought back as an homage to Rasputin, so that was a nice touch, even though this was like the third introduction of Ikelos weapons. The other seasonal weapons had a couple unique ones. Path of Least Resistance is nice thanks to Volt Shot and Shoot to Loot, and Judgment of Kelgarath was the first to get close to melee, which is nice in melee based builds, and it's an aggressive frame, so as a glaive, it hits harder with the melee. But again, nothing too amazing. Wendigo was brought back with the Nightfall loot pool, but you could no longer get blinding, aka disorienting grenades, which was a little disappointing to me. We got the Rose hand cannon back as a comp reward, and this thing feels super crispy. So that was kind of nice, as it's good to have a loot chase back in comp. We did get a cool exotic mission to get a very unique and customizable weapon in the Revision 0 Pulse Rifle. This thing is very unique and actually quite strong, and it's good in PvE and PvP. It can shoot as a 2 burst or a 4 burst, and the traits you can put on it at the relic all make it play differently. And like I said, the mission was very neat, probably ranked somewhere around Presage. So overall, this is a very mid-season. Nothing that stood out as awful like with Season of the Plunder, but certainly nothing that blew me away. I give it a solid C. Passable for sure, but not amazing. And that brings us up to Lightfall and the year we are in now. Lightfall brought a new raid, of course, in Root of Nightmares, which was basically a raid for beginners, and the day one experience left a lot to be desired, to say the least. It has been solo flawless on all characters since, so I think it's safe to say it was a little undertuned and half-baked. Lightfall also changed the way mods work. Very disappointing for me, as my super in-depth hour and 40 minute long mod video is now useless, but it's a relic of the past to a time when build crafting was more complex and in-depth. But Lightfall wasn't all bad. It brought in some truly amazing quality of life changes, and it is still bringing in more to this day, which is great for someone who plays a lot of Destiny like me. It also brought a new strike in the Hypernet Current and revamped versions of Lake of Shadows and the Arms Dealer. And you can now farm exotics in the Vex Strike Force on Neomuna and not just Lost Sectors like you could before. It also introduced 6 new exotic armor pieces with some strand specific ones for each class. Oh yeah, did I mention they gave us our 5th subclass in Strand? Strand has been a huge hit in my opinion and a very welcome addition to the game. We also got a catalyst for the Quicksilver Storm, which makes it even better. But as for Season of Defiance, for the second season in a row, Bungie actually introduced the Crucible map. This one was Cathedral of Dusk from D1, and personally, I think it's my most hated map. Yes, even worse to me than Disjunction. I do not like this map. It also brought with it Defiant Battlegrounds, which were just more battlegrounds basically. The seasonal weapons had some decent ones in the bunch, with Royal Executioner being the one that I used the most. The ritual weapon was Ecliptic Distaff, which is basically just a basic Void Glaive with some Void 3.0 synergy. And speaking of Void Glaives, we also got an exotic Void Glaive with the Vex Caliber. This was a cool exotic mission in the Vex network, and definitely was the highlight of the season for me. And the exotic weapon from the season pass was Vergloss Curve. When it was introduced, I didn't give it much attention because Stasis had been power crept out of relevancy, but this season, I started to play around with it and was extremely impressed by how good it is. Again, these are the hardest seasons to judge since they coincide with expansions, but overall, it was fairly light on content, so I'm giving it a C. And then we had Season of the Deep, so we were back to summer seasons being shit, even though this one was the second season of an expansion. This one brought fishing into the game, which personally, I didn't care for. And you had to fish a lot if you wanted to unlock the new exotic mission for the Wicked implement. This is a pretty cool exotic scout rifle with lots of stasis synergy, and the exotic mission had us fighting a tormentor, which was pretty cool, but overall, I didn't really like this exotic mission. Not as much as the other ones anyways. The season pass exotic was Centrifuge, which is a pretty good arc auto rifle and has some cool gameplay elements worked into it. I'm a pretty big fan of this thing. The missions were deep dives which had some roguelike elements in it and were quite fun and challenging. And then we had the 6-player salvage missions, which I thought sucked and they were quite boring. So you win some, you lose some. But overall, for me, again, I don't love to game in the summer, so this was a good time for me to take a bit of a break. We also got the Ghost of the Deep dungeon. I thought this was great on the first playthrough, but the slow movement through the water and the long opening encounter just killed the replayability for me. And the bosses really need to not have that overshield. It's extremely annoying for solo runs. So yes, this dungeon does have a great aesthetic, but I don't overly like it today. The weapons were decent from it, with Cold Comfort being a standout. And the exotic is a Strand Trace Rifle, the Navigator, which has some really awesome synergy with Strand, especially Strand Titan. The ritual weapon was the Last Rite, which was similar to the long arm from Spire of the Watcher and Dead Man's Tale. The weapons from this season were reprised weapons from the Reckoning days, and then we had some weapons with a Taken aesthetic which look really cool, but none of them are very good at all. And the exotics for each class were Cenotaph Mask, which is awesome on Warlock, Triton Vice, which is alright on Hunter, and Arbor Warden, which is trash on Titan. I said as much in my review of it and got flamed, and you want to know something? I've not seen anyone use it in Trials or regular Crucible since it came out, and I've not seen it in PvE either. So yeah, I proved the haters wrong. That shit is trash. So to recap, I liked deep dives and the stuff Bungie was trying with that, so props for being innovative, but overall, I think this season was C tier at best. Next, we have the penultimate season, Season of the Witch. I very much enjoyed this season for what it was. I think the Hive are the most interesting faction in the game, and I think Savathûn is the coolest character in the game. I thought Savathûn's Spire and Altars of Summoning were both good activities, and I liked the secrets throughout the season. And I also really enjoyed the difficulty of Tier 3 Altars. It matched up to how power crept we've become. The Deck of Whispers was a very cool idea and played more into the roguelike elements with more modifiers for activities. And the Mbaru engine missions were also very cool with some neat puzzles. The seasonal weapons were all pretty mid, and the Exderis exotic GL from the season pass wasn't great, but it is super unique and very cool that they modeled it after a Hive Knight Boomer Blast, so big props on that. The exotic armor pieces are all pretty good too. I love using Pyrogel gauntlets even in endgame activities, and Briarbinds are incredibly powerful. I would be using them way more this season if we had some Void Surges and Void Artifact mods, but I can't wait to use them more in the future. And Mothkeeper's wraps are just kinda whatever, but 2 really good exotics in one season is all you can ask for. Like, they're very strong. We also got the Crota's End raid reprised, and it was a return to form on challenging day 1 raids. I loved the challenging combat difficulty, and I loved how they reworked the encounters for D2. I also loved that they shut everyone up who said that the raid would be a cakewalk because it was easy in D1. The loot is also really good, which is always nice, and it's cool to have Necrochasm back in D2. Malediction was the ritual weapon, which was just another hand cannon, nothing too special about it whatsoever, which is sort of the norm with where ritual weapons sit today. This season also kind of shook up the traditional grid upgrade chart, which was sorely needed as people were sick of it after like 3+ years of dealing with it. Season of the Witch gets a solid A tier from me, and for what seasons have become, it's probably S tier. Like, for what a Destiny season is in this day and age, it's about as good as it gets. But when you can compare it to things like Black Armory and Season of Opulence, it doesn't quite reach that bar. So like I said, a very solid A tier. A very good season for modern day Bungie. And that brings us to Season of the Wish, officially the longest season in Destiny history. It began November 28th and will end on June 4th, over 6 months long. Again, as with all of the delays, I love it. It has given me time to make super long videos like this, among many other videos that I've wanted to make for a long time, but I've just been far too busy. So I'm actually grateful for the delay and hope Final Shape launches as a masterpiece. I think we all deserve it. But on to Season of the Wish. I know I've glossed over a ton of story beats from all the seasons, but this video is extremely long and story isn't my specialty, gameplay is. But in Season of the Wish, we conjure Riven to make a final wish for us. A wish to let us through the portal so we can enter the Traveler and take on the Witness. And Crow is going to be the guy to lead us in. So anyways, back to gameplay stuff, we got the Chivalric Fire Caster Frame Sword for the ritual weapon. Again, just a very basic weapon. The seasonal playlist is the Coil and Riven's Lair. Essentially the same thing. It sees us take on a bunch of different encounters and they get progressively harder. And every higher tier you go, the more loot that you get. This activity absolutely rains loot on you, which is good. And we now have way more sources for Ascendant Alloy. Or at least it's easier to obtain. It is kind of the culmination of everything that they've been working towards. It has a progressive difficulty of deep dives and the roguelike elements after each tier where you can select an upgrade. It is far more user friendly than the card system in Season of the Witch, and you can actually choose from a variety of options unlike in deep dives. So Bungie is growing and learning. We also have an easier upgrade path than ever as opposed to the grid-like structure that had weekly time gates. This one you can unlock just by playing and beating certain triumphs. This is a much nicer system. It seems that Bungie is learning and I'm very excited for the future, because they do seem to be making better seasons of late, so episodes should be promising. I didn't even mention another big overhaul earlier, but the change in the seasonal artifact mods being applied to the artifact and not your armor was a massive improvement to build crafting as a whole. And the seasonal artifact this season is the best one we've ever had. I wish I had all the previous artifacts, as I would love to do a ranking video on those as well. They've really improved over time. Another massive change with Lightfall was not having to level up every season. This did more to improve my relationship with the game than anything. Now I could just jump into the content that I want to play and not have to regrind an arbitrary number every 3 months, which I had done for literal years, at least 16 times over. So mad props there. Sadly, we didn't get any new exotic armor pieces with this season, but as you can see by this video, there was always a season in between expansions that we didn't get any. We did get another new exotic mission though, which made 3 out of 4 seasons where we got them. Vex Caliber, Wicked Implement, and this season we got Starcross with the Strand Bow Wishkeeper, which is a very good exotic and you can customize it how you want. We also got the Warlord's Ruin Dungeon with the Buried Bloodline exotic sidearm, a new type of Scorn crossbow style weapon which is really good. And we also got the new special rocket sidearm Indebted Kindness, which is the first of its kind, and Bungie has said they're releasing more in the final shape. So again, Bungie knocked it out of the park with those, I think. People bitch about the loot pool of that dungeon, but Spire the Watcher is way worse for loot in my opinion. The sidearm and bow are well worth farming, and the dungeon itself is great. One of, if not the best dungeon we've ever gotten. The pacing is awesome, having 3 bosses is awesome, it's just a magnificent dungeon. Again, Bungie is really learning. We also got Dragon's Breath, and I mentioned earlier how people say things suck before playing with them. Well, people thought this thing sucked, but it is literally a meta pick, especially for solo play. It is the best seasonal weapon we've gotten since Witherhoard, and ironically does damage over time just like Witherhoard. It could well be the best seasonal exotic we've ever gotten. I didn't even touch on the weapons from the season yet, but they're alright. A Stasis Legendary Trace Rifle is nice to have for build flexibility, and Scatter Signal is a standout weapon for this season. And they also brought back the Season of the Undying weapons, but this time they're actually good. Seriously, the perk pools are very nice. And we got the Undercurrent Arc Waveframe Grenade Launcher for strikes, and the Incisor Strand Trace Rifle for trials. So all in all, some absolutely outstanding loot this season. Dragon's Breath is a must-have, and there are lots of other good ones like I mentioned. And we even got some amazing world drops with Crux Termination, Rossarago 4, and Marcato 45. They all have some outstanding rolls if you get lucky with RNG. So Season of the Wish also gets an A tier rating, and that was before the free update we got with Into the Light. I wrote the initial version of this script back in February, and I didn't have much in the way of expectations for Into the Light. But wow, Bungie blew my socks off with this update. They introduced Onslaught, which is a horde mode that the community has wanted for a long time. I mentioned how it seemed like Bungie was learning. Well, this is proof. This game mode has a legend version which is harder but grants more loot, which is how it should be. Harder content should be more rewarding. But there's also a regular version, and both versions progress in difficulty the higher you go. This is great for newer players to dip their toes into harder content. It starts out easy so they can maybe beat the first 10 waves, and then it gets harder over time. So if they keep at it, eventually they'll go further and get better. They also don't have surges, which is amazing for build crafting. They do have overcharged weapons though, which I think is fine. But the no surges has made Onslaught my absolute favorite activity to test out builds in. I absolutely love it. I made a whole video on why I love it, so watch that if you want more commentary. But for now, I want to shift the focus back to Into the Light as a whole. They brought back 12 beloved weapons from the past, and basically all of them have god rolls that are on par with or better than the best raid weapons. Like seriously, perk-wise, Midnight Coup is the best hand cannon in the game. That's crazy for a free-to-play addition to the game. They also introduced an all-black shader called Super Black, which is another thing that the community has wanted for ages. On top of all this, they introduced the Whisper and 0 Hour exotic missions, the 2 best exotic missions to ever come out in Destiny 2. They added little wrinkles to them to make them a bit tougher thanks to how power crept we are, but overall they aren't as challenging as they were in the past. That being said, it is just nice to have these absolutely iconic missions back in the game so that newer players can experience some of the best content that Destiny has to offer. And we aren't even done. On top of this, they also introduced Pantheon, which is a raid style gauntlet. This is awesome for endgame players who love to raid. Sadly, they have said it's going away in the final shape, but Onslaught will be sticking around. But back to Pantheon, I was extremely impressed with it. It added a few new challenges to each mission, with things like newer or stronger enemies or the addition of Tormentors. The planet's boss also spawns its fire wave before damage and it hurts like hell. These are small additions, but I expected them to be the exact same, just with a power delta each week. So props to Bungie for adding some additional difficulty. I do think it is a shame this content is going away after being in the game for only a month, but it is what it is. On top of the Pantheon update we also got 3 new Crucible maps. We had a stretch of well over 500 days without a Crucible map being added, and then Bungie adds 3 in one go. So this was a nice free addition as well. They also introduced Hardware, which is a guns only PvP mode, something that I've personally wanted for years. Like I said, early in Destiny 2 I played a lot of Crucible, but with the amount of ability spam it just became less and less fun for me. So I hope this game mode sticks around because I just love shooting my gun in Destiny 2 PvP. So Wish got an A tier, but Into the Light gets an S tier for me. This is truly the most fun I've ever had in Destiny 2. Raid bosses are very fun, so a gauntlet of them is just awesome. Whisper and Zero Hour will always hold a special place in my heart, even if they are a bit easier to beat now. And Onslaught is a perfect testing ground for builds, which is my favorite thing to do in Destiny, make unique and fun builds. So truly, Into the Light is the best content to me out of all the seasons. Now if Bungie would just add a testing ground and a kinetic slot legendary glaive, then the game would be perfect. So yeah, we had back-to-back A-tier seasons going into the final shape, and then a free addition to the game that has some of the best content they have ever produced. Things really seem like they are lining up for the final shape to be an absolute banger. It may even rival or possibly surpass Forsaken, which is lofty expectations, but it does seem like Bungie is firing on all cylinders right now. And I'm glad we got to end on a positive note. We started off strong with the first few seasons of Destiny and Black Armory and Opulence, and I think we finished super strong as well. So let's do a recap. In no particular order, at the bottom in D tier, we have Curse of Osiris, a season Bungie themselves admitted almost killed Destiny. Undying, the season that launched aside probably the weakest expansion in Destiny 2. Hunt, which was the season that launched with probably the second worst expansion in Destiny 2. And Plunder, a season with some good seasonal activities, but trash weapons and design choices that prioritize player engagement over player fun. It was alright, but it was way too grindy and it killed player morale. In C tier, first up we have Worthy, a pretty unmemorable season with a crappy seasonal activity, and again, Bungie tried to make the community farm it late in the season way more than anyone wanted to. And maybe the worst seasonal weapons in the history of the franchise to boot. Splicer, a decent season, but also nothing really stood out. Season of the Risen, not an awful season, but it launched alongside a great expansion, so Witch Queen carried the load while Risen was just a serviceable season. Seraph, probably the best of the C tier seasons, but it didn't do much for me personally. Defiance, probably the best season to launch alongside an expansion, but again, the seasons tied to expansions tend to be lackluster. But this one was fine, nothing special, but certainly not horrible. And Deep, just another whatever season, nothing too exciting for me personally. I was also going through some shit in the summer of 2023, so maybe I just have a personal negative bias, but it just didn't click with me. In the B tier, we have Red War. Destiny launched in a pretty rough state overall, but there was lots of hype for a sequel. Plus, this hardly counts as a season, so sure, B it is. Arrivals, a long season that I personally very much enjoyed. Chosen, a very strong addition to the game with battlegrounds and some weapons that started to have some strong and unique perks. Lost was a season with really good seasonal activity gameplay that I quite enjoyed. And then Haunted. The addition of Solar 3.0 was awesome, as was the Duality Dungeon, and the seasonal gameplay was decent as well, going into the backstories of many of Destiny's revered characters. In the A tier, I have Joker's Wild, aka Season of the Drifter. Bungie was being very innovative this season, so I gave them some props for that, but it's probably the weakest A tier season overall. Season of the Dawn had super memorable weapons and great seasonal armor. Player agency and target farming, a decent playlist activity in the Sundial, and a big community puzzle in the Corridors of Time. I really liked Season of the Dawn. 30th Anniversary is being added here. While not technically a season, it was really good. The PvP sandbox was in a really good place, and the legendary Galahorn returned with the new dungeon. It was a good update to keep us occupied for an extended season. In Season of the Witch, Bungie built on the roguelike elements with the card system. It had 2 fun and challenging seasonal activities, and Eris Morn and the Hive always deliver a good narrative experience. And then Season of the Wish. Again, a very solid season. Just an accumulation of everything Bungie learnt over the years on how to make a good season. Then we go to S tier. Warmind helped save the game in my opinion with the Whisper of the Worm mission and Escalation Protocol. And to go along with these fun and challenging activities was actual good loot to chase. Forsaken, S+ tier, enough said. Black Armory, truly iconic weapons, and Niobe Labs was a wonderful experience, plus a fun raid. And finally, Season of Opulence. The cream of the crop for seasonal activities in the menagerie, it hasn't been topped since. Plus there was a really challenging and cool title to grind in Shadow. And there was lots of player agency for doing your focus farming of certain weapons. I just can't say enough good about Season of Opulence. And even though it wasn't a season, Into the Light also goes into S tier. I can't sing its praises enough. It is everything I like about Destiny. Great gameplay and activities. I'm fine that there's no story with it, I'm just happy to be having fun playing Destiny again. And after 25 pages and 16,000 words, I can finally wrap this script up. If you're still watching, I don't even know what to say. Thank you so much for listening to me ramble. I hope you enjoyed it. The script and research alone took me over 20 hours, and the editing was probably way more. So leave a like on the video to help me out, and subscribe for more Destiny 2 content. I plan on going hard in the final shape, and I really look forward to what the future of Destiny has to offer. Once again, thanks so much for watching, and take care.